would like to welcome on the stage our moderator for the first session, Mr. Lasse Ringius. He is the Director and Head of Green Investment Services at Global Green Growth Institute, to moderate our first session, along with our expert panelist, Mr. Nayef Al-Haddad, Manager of Research and Strategic Planning at the Kuwait Authority of Partnership Projects, Mr. Wissam Rabadi, Chief of Party of the Jordan Competitiveness Program JCP, a USAID funded program, Mr. Sebastien, the General Counsel of Veolia Middle East. Thanks. That's all. Over to you, Lasse, please.
Thank you, and welcome. As we have said a few times, the idea here is to have a dialogue, so we will try to keep it as informal as we possibly can. We have a very good panel, I should say, here with the three gentlemen to my left, or to my right, sitting from where you are, and two are representing the private sector and the public sector, and then Sebastien is more from the private sector. So we also have different angles that we are using to exploring public-private partnerships, and there's no need, I think, to go into the relevance of this, but as a general heading, we are here talking about ways in which public and private sector can deliver services, where the private sector will be managing an asset over a certain period of time and will be investing the project, and then will return it to the government according to whatever has been agreed legally behind the parties. There are some challenges, there are some success stories, and there are some lessons to be learned, and this is what we all want to hear about, and we also want to hear from your side. So maybe without further ado, if I could turn to Nayef Al-Haddad, and sorry for my mispronunciations, maybe we kick it off with an icebreaker, which is something like, tell us some of is there a success model for PPPs? What are some of the challenges? You have managed a large amount of PPPs, and there's a particular structure in Kuwait, which are probably, like any other structure, has benefits and maybe challenges. So we'll just start with that question.
Thank you, Lasse. When we talk about the PPP projects in the region, especially, let's say, for example, if we put a micro even focus on the GCC region itself, more than there are different practices that happen across the region. What we'd like to see is actually we have to learn from each other's experience. When we have started the first PPP project in Kuwait, it was built and based on the multiple models used by other countries to create a hybrid, accommodating the local laws and requirements for the state itself. Now, when we interact with the private sector, for example, with Bernard himself representing the private sector, what the private developers and the lenders want to see is a clear and very transparent policy. And this is what even Ms. Aisha talked about, one of the pillars needed for the PPP project. What is the policy? What is that there is a legal framework that would allocate the risk allocation between the public and the private, and determine what are the laws and the rights between the both parties. Now, another issue, which would be a serious, and even, I would say, for example, demonstrate the success of the state itself in taking this PPP program into hand, is that there is a strategic plan made by the state itself, which would list all the projects made available and upcoming in a good format of timeline that would showcase the potential for the private sector to be engaged in, to allocate their resources, and even for the lenders themselves to know what is upcoming from the state. Of course, along with that plan, there has to be a market monitoring for other projects in the region. We talk about even other countries surrounding nearby countries. And even also, we talk about the financial market situation. When the 2015, the oil prices went down, a lot of projects was canceled because of the effect. And most of these projects are even funded in US dollars. And another thing is also, for example, there has to be a political support for these projects to be considered as a state project itself. In Kuwait, we have, in the first PPP project, there was a lot of political challenge from the parliament and also the public. The public needs to accept these projects. They need to understand it, because in essence, they don't know what's behind these projects. They think it's an investment project. But for example, and to give a very detailed example on the public engagement in the PPP projects in Kuwait, by the Kuwaiti PPP law, for projects which are exceeding, for example, actually this is by the law itself determined, 60 million Kuwaiti dinars, an SPV company will be established for that project, and it will be a joint stock listed company with 50% of the shares for the public. So there is an engagement for the public to have shares in these PPP companies. And it will also have a return on investment for them, aside from the creation of jobs. So there are incentives for the public acceptance, whereas in other places, actually, the public doesn't see that effect because it's usual depending on bilateral engagement between the stakeholders and the private sector themselves.
Great, thank you very much, and maybe we can move on to Jordan. What are some of the experiences and lessons learned in your tendering processes?
Thank you. Well, I think Mr. Nayef said it is a common best practice of developing public-private partnerships. Again, as in Jordan, I think an example is that in 2011, with oil prices skyrocketing and the Egyptian gas pipeline was disrupted, the country found itself in a really difficult position in terms of energy. So again, a political decision, a public policy energy reform decision was taken that we need to diversify our energy sources. And a target was put in that policy to say that at least 15% of our energy should be clean energy by 2020, and I think we will pass that number by 2020. But that policy also should be translated into a specific strategy, right, with strategic objectives and KPIs that translated later into laws, into a regulatory framework, and eventually to a transparent and efficient and socially and environmentally impactful procedures. And that's indeed what happened in that case, that a public-private partnership was developed between the government and what they call the independent power producers, which is the private sector in this case, and the government went into an agreement of a power purchasing agreement with the private sector, over 15 years at a specific price of electricity. Now that worked, but I think the lesson learned, and we learned a lesson in this process. Now that was phase one, which was about 200 megawatt, then phase two, about 300 megawatt, and then phase three, which is about another 300 watt, a total of about 700 megawatt. That's about $1 billion worth of investment. That was totally financed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IFC, or some other local and international banks, because it was a very bankable project. But in the first phase, and here is the issue about transparency and most important, predictability of the regulatory framework for the private sector, because by the time the government agreed with about 12 independent power producers at, I think it was an 18 cents per kilowatt hour, during that process, the technology was changing so fast, the prices were dropped so fast, so the government came back after 2 years and say, you know what, I think we're just going to pay 15 piastres for kilowatt hour. Well, the investor already made their calculation based on 15 years, 18 cents per kilowatt hour. Now this has changed the whole business plan. This changed the whole investment and the return on investment. And most important, it really jeopardized the government's credibility with the private sector. So a lot of people interfere, and from the highest level, and we said we need to stick to our original proposal, and we have to have predictability in the legal system and regulatory system that allow and give the confidence for the private sector to go into long-term public-private partnerships. There is always risk, and technology changes very fast, and that's part of the risk in such, especially particularly in big infrastructure projects when it comes to renewable energy, that technology is faced, as we hear today, technology is changing more than the mobile technology when it comes to renewable energy and now storage and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the lesson learned is that you need a stable, predictable regulatory framework. You need to have social impact, in my opinion, where people should feel why this is important, particularly at a time where, you know, in many of our countries, transparency is still not at its best, and people sometimes question the motives and the issues and who's benefiting out of these public-private partnerships. And the public absolutely need to have a full understanding of why we're doing this and the benefit. And I think many of the benefit, of course, environmental, but we also notice that, or we always say there is a lot of jobs being created and private businesses started because of these large public-private partnerships. So I would say, let's see, that's the main lesson learned over the past few years.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I think that that's an important point, the one about public buy-in, or it's obvious what the benefits of such projects are. It's not unusual that if a service that used to be provided by the government is probably provided by a private company, there might be some raised eyebrows. I think that happens once in a while. So in the case of Veolia, you are operating in the whole region and across 3 sectors, water, energy, and waste. Is there a success formula for a PPP or 1 or 2 types that for you when you participate as a bidder that you would like to see being put on the table?
So, without repeating what has been said so far, I mean, I can only concur with what has been said. Sometimes when I have a training in my office and I like to draw and I'm trying to explain what is a PPP, I usually draw a triangle, because for me what is important in a PPP is the last P, which stands for partnership. So it's basically a partnership, but for me the partnership is between 3 main players. You have the government or the governmental entity providing the secured framework, the regulatory framework, the environment. The government securing the offtake throughout a PPP or water purchase agreement, eventually backing the project through a sovereign guarantee when required. You then have the private player, which is here to invest equity on the project, brings new technology, savings potentially. And then, of course, you have the lenders. Most of those projects are project finance, non-recourse project finance, so you have the lenders. Lenders usually are keen to find, very steady, very predictable environment. I think this is the word which has been used, and this is what they're looking for. So the more the environment is safe, the more there is a visibility, the more competition a government or a dedicated country will get, with prices going down, and of course more private players investing in such a country. So it's a kind of recipe between those 3 combinations.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? When you look at the assets that are being made available through tendering, are these assets that you would consider risky and thus there are expectations of high returns, or are these more, low risk, low returns that would probably make lenders such as banks quite comfortable?
Lenders are usually not so much interested in the returns that the sponsor are going to make. Mm-hmm. What they want to be sure is that the asset they are going to finance through debt will generate the cash flows as expected as per the business plan, so the sponsors can service the debt all over the project. Mm-hmm. Now, talking about returns, it's all about the risk, the political risk in a dedicated area, and also the risk linked to the business. If I can just give an example, usually in the region, the desalination projects are probably the ones where the returns are the lowest. For a simple reason, the technology is now quite mature in general. They are safe contracts in most of the cases. It's long-term offtake commitment from the off-taker. But when you go through wastewater, for instance, the returns are a bit higher because you have a bit less competition. The technology, or it's a bit more technological. The risks are a bit higher. You have a question of quality of the input, quality of the output. Waste to energy usually have also good returns. District cooling are higher, but of course there as well the risks are very, very high. I mean, just higher, so the returns goes at the same level.
Okay, great. Can we talk a little bit about monitoring? So once the asset is now in the hands of a private company, what is needed in terms of monitoring? What is the experience? I guess maybe can also be a bit challenging to monitor some of these private companies if you come from the public sector. So, no, I was thinking. So I will go. Yeah. I will mechanically. I will went to our first speaker. So, Mr. Al-Haddad, if you could.
I just wanted to add one point just before going to the monitoring. The most important factor into having a successful PPP formula is, I would say, the constitution, or like the institutional environment itself, the local environment. We talk about like the banking, we talk about like the legal. You know, from my own right now experience in tendering the PPP projects in Kuwait, the current applicable laws or the related laws needs to be progressive to accommodate the lender's requirements. Honestly, you know, not all the laws of the region or like the countries are similar. They have like, you know, their own privacy in this. And what happens is that, you know, the private sector would sometimes find a challenge in accommodating each country and their laws. In the first PPP project, you know, there is a law for companies, establishing the companies. It was an obstacle from the beginning, and it was changed after implementing the first PPP project. So there has to be a progressive flow of, I would say, reviewing the applicable laws to make it accommodating the economic growth of the country itself. Now, for the monitoring, this is actually also like, you know, very true. That's happening, you know, right now, even locally, and I believe also regionally. The public entities are very new to this kind of framework of dealing with the private sector on a client-user basis. And they have to, you know, the private sector have to sometimes even baby walk them into this kind of process. Especially you talk about like, you know, the commercial transactions, the settlement, the dispute resolution. So the public sector themselves have to have support, actually, and even sometimes from the private sector themselves, although sometimes even from independent parties or consultancy, into understanding what are the requirements and what are the risks when they're going for these PPP projects. They have to have the proper hierarchy, and I would say maybe a better, more smooth bureaucracy in related to dealing with this private sector, in order to make this project a success story, you know, for each project itself. Now, of course, for each project, there are three angles. You talk about technical, you talk about like financial and legal. So the public entity themselves, they need to work hard on themselves into order like this. I know that, you know, one of the challenges, and this is from, actually I've been going around and looking at other countries' experiences. And even till date, you know, when I'm listening to Wissam's story, you know, and what he's saying, I've been actually putting a plan to get into contact with countries like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and some other countries in the region to learn from their tendering process and how they're dealing with the financial settlement. And I believe in one of the countries I mentioned, the financial settlement is done through a central unit in the Ministry of Finance, in their local Ministry of Finance. It's not being practiced locally at the state of Kuwait, which creates a problem in the discrepancy and sometimes the delays and even understanding the method of the settlement. This is a risk on the private sector. And it also actually makes a negative, a negative influence on the lenders in the future project. This is one of the things that has to be taken into account.
I see Mr. Rabadi is nodding, so maybe your experience is somewhat similar in Jordan, or?
Yes, absolutely. The government is in, you know, for the longest time until, 20 years ago, when the government owned all, infrastructure projects. The government was doing everything. So this whole idea to give control to the private sector is a new idea. People still trying to understanding according to their own environment. We did have in Jordan a public-private partnership unit under the Ministry of Finance. And I can tell you that is not working very well either. So because they don't seem to have all the authority and the power to, so we're saying, well, maybe it should be under the Prime Minister's office or what have you. So each public-private partnership is a whole new, you go through a whole new process from scratch again, and you don't have that clear framework for the investor or the private sector to understand what is the process. And except, for example, in the renewable energy part, we have something called direct proposals, which is a method by which the private sector will come to the government with a proposal on financial and technical and legal proposal about how they will produce electricity from renewable energy. And another case that we're seeing right now, we're working through that case. So because 40% of energy about 40% of energy in Jordan is being spent on transportation, the government made, again, a public policy decision and say, and to add to that, we had a high taxation on vehicles, on cars in general, that reaches 100% tax. So the government decided that we will give zero taxation, total exemption on electric vehicles. If you buy an electric vehicle, you pay no taxes, no customs, which made the cars very attractive to the consumer. Now we're seeing also almost like 300% annual growth in purchasing electric vehicles. The problem now is you need some sort of a public infrastructure for charging these electric vehicles. Yes, to charge it at home, but still most countries who adopted this kind of technology, they usually have some sort of a public transport, public charging stations around. Well, the government doesn't have money to invest in these things, so they're looking for the private sector. That needed a lot of regulation to be changed, because if you are charging other people's electrical vehicles, now you're like a utility. You are selling electricity, which require you to have a license for that. And we didn't have the laws to how do we offer a license with a certain tariff and a certain safety requirement for these charging stations. In one case, one of the gas stations in Jordan had a Tesla charging station on top of his gas tank, which was a really big hazard if something is to happen. So there need to be safety regulations to that. We're still going through that process. We're still trying to figure out how do we do this. The government still does not understand this technology. They're a bit confused about what kind of charging, what kind of technologies do you use, who do you deal with, how do you tender this whole thing. So that's why it's taking a bit of time. But absolutely, it's a learning process. We are new to this, but it is at least for countries like Jordan, who doesn't have, government doesn't have the capital resources to invest in infrastructure. Public-private partnership tend to be the only way to go forward.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating to hear about the takeoff of electrical vehicles in Jordan. Now, Sebastien, you are operating in 3 different sectors. Are some of them a better fit for PPPs, or what's your view?
Veolia is not a power producer as such, but despite this fact, I could say that the natural utilities, such as power and water, are, of course, very well structured under PPPs because they are tendered by government or by governmental entities. You have long-term offtake agreements which are somehow backed by the governments, which, of course, makes those projects very interesting in terms of bankability. In the region, we see also new types of PPPs, from housing, construction of hospitals, even schools. I saw recently on some news. Maybe one day we will see, like in Europe, roads or tolls or bridges or tunnels, which can also go through those models. After, of course, you have a risk of volume, so it will be depend how the risk will be viewed by the players locally. And another type of PPP, which is also not always very well known, is district cooling. District cooling in the region, I mean, which is of course quite interesting on a pure environmental point of view, but the structuring of district cooling is always very difficult because it's linked to real estate. It's more the private sector. So you have a private developer or a state-owned developer which develop a whole area. And as it's a greenfield project, in order to avoid any, conventional cooling system, they will have on the ground built a proper district cooling plant to service, in terms of chilled water, all the development there. So you also see that type of infrastructure which is developed under PPPs. In Sadia, Thailand, it has been done. Tabrid is doing a lot of things similar in Abu Dhabi. In Bahrain as well. So yeah, this probably these are the type of infrastructure I see today which can be subject to PPPs.
So as we said at the outset, there's a lot of experience on the panel here, but there's also a lot of experience in the audience. So at this point, I wanted to hear if there are any questions or maybe somebody want to share some observations. I believe we have microphones, and so please, can we have a microphone for this gentleman?
Okay. Thank you. My name is Jihad Sawair. I am the technical advisor to the Minister of Environment and the Director of the Green Economy Unit in Jordan. I would like just to make a small comment about the public-private partnership efforts in Jordan, in the Ministry of Environment in specific. We at the Ministry of Environment, we strongly believe that green economy in general and the implementation of green projects cannot actually be done without the support and the help of the private sector. We as a government, we have the duties of providing the right policies and the right laws and regulation. But on the other hand, the private sector has the skills and has the money to invest in these projects. And I think in general there is a problem, and there is there is a lack of confidence in general, not only in Jordan maybe, in the partnership between the two sectors, because the private sector, they don't, most of the time, they don't believe in public projects. And this has to be changed. The private sector should be incentivized to invest in green projects. And actually, as a Ministry of Environment, we have some examples of PPP projects. For example, we are now making the transaction advisory studies for one of the biggest environmental projects in Jordan, which is the establishment of an industrial wastewater treatment plant in Zarqa area, where Zarqa encompasses around 60% of the industries in Jordan. So in this project, the project was designated by the government as a PP project, and we are also working in the recycling and the collection of used acid lead batteries project with the private sector. And also we are working in the management. We will be soon tendering a project about the hazardous waste in Jordan for the private sector. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I believe there's another question or comment. Yep, please.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the invitation. I am Hassan Harraq from SIE from Morocco. I am the Director of Finance and Administration. My comment there is specific because in Morocco, SIE developed with the municipality and private and SIE new models in some area like street lighting, waste to energy, and green transportation. And to realize that, we have worked with some ministry or municipality and others to develop the model. We start with street lighting on 2014, and we have do a pilot in municipality of Saleh. It's near to Rabat, and we succeed that model. With the success story, we do now we have more than 10 municipalities do that. And for the last experience, we are going to work with a coalition of municipalities in Agadir, because Agadir is surrounded by about 14 municipalities, and we want to do that for all the municipalities together to have the same sort of lighting. After that, in COP22, we start with the municipality of Marrakesh for the green transportation. And the person that was in the Marrakesh, they have more than 15 buses working with electricity. With this model, we have developed another PPP model, and now we are going to work with that with other municipalities like Agadir, like El Jadida, and other cities in Morocco. Another one, we develop waste to energy. For the municipality, we give you only the example what SIE do with the municipality and the private. And I want to tell you that it's very important on this new area to have success stories, because without success stories, we can develop the model and duplicated in other municipality. Because for the first pilot for the street lighting, we have some two problems. The private one don't want to work on this PPP because he have afraid that the municipality is not going to pay the price to pay the private. And another, it's the banks. We have a problem to fund the finance because it's a new model, and the bank don't want to do that. That it's very important to develop success stories to have that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just would like to ask the gentleman. These projects were materialized, right? What's the economic kickback for Morocco or for the municipality itself when they develop these new projects, which we have never heard about the region? I mean, like, when we talk about the tall bridges, we talk about like the street lighting. These are very, I would call them small scale to medium.
Yes.
But there is a benefit that came back to these municipalities.
Yes. Yes, because for all the municipalities of Morocco, they do it directly, and they have lots of problems. Because with that model, we start with the municipality of Saleh, and we decrease because we do energy efficiency in the managing street lighting, and we have decreased the consumption of the bill by 50%. After we work with another model with Marrakesh, and with Marrakesh, with the tender, they have the private come with a business plan that they show that they can decrease the consumption by 60%, and the light will be work at 83% all the time. That model, now it's work because for the first tender we have only one company come to the PPP, but after for Marrakesh or others, we have more than 14 or 20 company coming from France, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy, from Canada, that you want to work on that. And we have finalized more than 7 tender, and we have company from Spain working on that project, from Morocco, from France, and from Italy, France, and Germany.
Now, this is a model I'd like, for example, to use in pushing for creating a diversity in the kind of portfolios of projects that could be tendered for PPP. For example, you know, initially, I sat down with some of the high officials in the state, and actually, they didn't take PPP projects for serious. They considered it as a means for the poor states, that's what I'm quoting, to tender the projects. Actually, no. It's the smartest way to engage into foreign investment, into opening up the local market and economy, and creation of jobs, and even the transfer of knowledge and the technology. I would like to tell you, for example, actually right now there is an upcoming project that's going to be in Kuwait. It will be, we're trying to look at the feasibility of tendering a museum on a PPP framework. Of course, it's not going to be a cash generator revenue. It will be subsidized. But then you talk about the cultural impact that it could make, the social. And right now we talk about like even small-scale projects such as street lighting, or even, you know, waste treatment on the municipalities, you know, size. This is the kind of stories that we'd like to hear, that it could happen, it could help the local community, and then also engage, not only we talk about, like, when we talk about the private sector, we don't have to go into the international, global sectors. We also talk like the local private sector themselves.
Yes.
And I think that's a good, maybe a good recommendations to the organizer to maybe, you know, publish some of these successful public-private partnerships that everybody here is aware of. Because I know in Jordan, and Mohandas Jihad, please correct me, I think the greater municipality of Amman managed to put an RFP and to do waste to energy of maybe 50 or 60 megawatt of waste to energy project. They were lucky because they control their own waste. Unfortunately, in other places of the country, like in the north, where there's about 1 million Syrian refugees living today, it's becoming an environmental disaster. And there has been many attempts to really do a waste to energy project, but I think it's a bit more difficult when you go outside Amman. Is that, you know, Ministry of Environment, the Ministry for Municipalities, Ministry of Energy, and the Electricity. So there is so many players in this place where you say, you know, waste doesn't have an owner in this whole system. But I think it will be a great idea to maybe, you know, see if we can capture some of these experiences and share them with the attendees.
Thanks. I think that's a very good idea. We should pick up on that. There's a question in the back, and thank you very much, Morocco, for the great questions, and also from Jordan.
Yeah, my name is Bashir Jama, and I work with the Islamic Development Bank at Jeddah. I just want to take the panelists and the audience to another area where we need partnership, and that is in the area of agriculture and food security. We had throughout these last 2 days that the MENA region is one that is food insecure, and there's tremendous potential for meeting that challenge in Africa, where we have tremendous potential for growing food for the rest of the world. This question perhaps goes to Nayef or Wissam. Can you visualize, can you see a partnership between private sector in this region? Jordan, for example, that produces a lot of good fertilizer. Here, Saudi Arabia, good fertilizer. Africa uses very little fertilizer, needs it. The private sector here that produces fertilizer is shy of investing in Africa because of unknown territory. The private sector that is engaged in fertilizer in Africa doesn't have the capital, doesn't have the know-how. So one has the innovation, one has the products, but they cannot cross easily. The other one doesn't have the resources. There are perhaps opportunities for Triple GI and others to help connect the two. But from your perspective, how can we get what is here that's very much needed into Africa to grow food for Africa as well as for this region? What role can PPP play? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a big question. I'm not sure. I know on the spot how to do that. I'm not familiar with the situation in Africa. But definitely it's something that, you know, I'm sorry, experts, maybe there's more experts who have done this around, and I don't know, Sebastien, if you've encountered something in this regard.
We talk about like partnerships, but across the border.
Yeah, if I may, I think that the question comes from the issue of food security, and there are some countries that are not growing their own food, so maybe by helping farmers in another country, maybe with fertilizer, and then it's the structure you would use for that, if I understood correctly. Could a PPP model or some version of that?
I came across a project. It was a direct proposal from a certain international company that was dealing with pure water. And we talk about that they have secured on an exclusive basis to transport pure, drinking water to whoever state is from different resources on a bilateral contracting. Now, this is one of the concepts. Right now, actually, I've been approached by a local scientific institute in Kuwait about they want to go into a food security program for a BBB, and this is a good approach right now. We are progressing in this kind of concept. But then when we talk about, for example, international investment, we call it like the gentleman mentioned that, we're dealing with mainly other countries which they need support and actually an investment in their side into creating a potential direct chain of supply of food, or I would say even products that could be served like this. This is done through even sometimes certain international funds, or the local, there's the Kuwait fund and there's the Islamic fund, and these programs actually, mainly at the beginning, is not made on a profit basis. It's mainly made to help the people to help themselves actually, and in order to I would say push up the scale of the economy for the country itself. But then, if certain maybe initiatives are made, like I said at the beginning, the BBB is in concept. If it's not even being accepted publicly, it could be a threat to the public themselves. And when this happens, it will be a risk for the lenders and the sponsors to participate in such project if they are considered in a hostile environment.
Yeah, if I can just add on top of that, I have maybe two examples to share. I mean, we just need to keep in mind one thing is we are talking about PPPs, and PPPs, I think it has been defined initially as somehow the financing of public services, of public assets by the private sector. So when we are talking about food or food production, we are probably a bit borderline, but what I have seen, and it's not a project of Veolia anyway, I think it was a project in maybe in Senegal or in Cameroon, where there was a wastewater treatment plant which was built under a pure PPP scheme and a long-term agreement with, I can't remember which body. But what has been structured around the plant itself, there was first all the, the sludges, the dry sludges were used, just basically given to the local farmers to be used as fertilizer in their fields. And on top of that, the company, the project company, in fact, was hiring some agronomic experts to help the farmers to use those fertilizers and to properly basically improve the production of their and the harvesting of what they were supposed to cultivate there. a bit far from the food, because we are somehow talking about social responsibility and how somehow the local population can benefit from an investment. Nayef was talking about, for instance, an IPO of the project company where the people can, get shares and potentially get, money out of those shares. But also, and now I'm talking more about Veolia, for instance, in Oman, around our desalination plant, which has been structured under a PPP and IWP. We also, first, we have hired local population to work in the plant, and most of those people were fishermen around the plant because it's in the Sharqiya region, which is quite far from Muscat. Most of them were just fishermen. They have been trained to become operators. In addition to that, we are also having, knowledge programs where we bring pupils and their teachers from schools to visit the plant to get some kind of training sessions. And more now, we are also doing some training session in universities. We do that in Abu Dhabi, we have done that in Muscat, and we expect to do that in some other areas as well. So I think it's really a global discussion about how can local population can benefit from that kind of schemes and from the investment made on a dedicated asset.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. I'll come back to you. There's a question over there, and if you'll be patient, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Sunday. I'm from Uganda. Maybe it's not a question, but maybe it's a compliment on PPP. The purpose, the intention of government vis-a-vis the business person in social development. In my country, for example, the government was interested in increasing the power supply, electricity, and it went into partnership with a private person, and the partnership worked, power was generated, and work was all done and progress. But at the end of recently, the government picked an interest in creation of more dams and for people to cut the cost of electricity. And now the businessman says if you increase the tariff, rather the more energy supply, that means you will reduce the cost of tariff, and man, we have made an agreement that we maintain the tariff. So the contradiction now, the government wants to lower the costs for public good, for public consumption. The businessman wants to maintain the profit margin. So now already the conflict in terms of business. So it's a bit tricky. I agree with gentlemen that social investment somehow contradicts the profit, the business sense, and it hits more in developing countries where even the cost of credit is still very high. So I don't know, it's a big contradiction, and maybe would have loved to see how it's done in much more developed countries. How is it done? How has it sustainably been done? Yeah, thank you.
Maybe we take one more question, and then we'll have responses from the panel on this.
It's like comments. I am Awad Salama, Head of Energy and Environment Division at Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation from Jordan. I would like to share our experience in SDGs and green economy. We recently launched the SDGs plan, which include goals and policy and indicator at the sectors level. Now, in cooperation with line ministries and GGI, we are trying to mapping between SDGs and green growth roadmap. We would like to use green economy as tools to achieve the SDGs. Regarding the PPP, the government of Jordan finalized and launched the PPP by law. This is, as Mr. Wissam said, they are institutionalized unit under the Ministry of Finance. But in the fast track, the government take a decision to establish a special committee for two sectors to implement PPP projects into the sector which is the highest priority of Jordan and at renewable energy and water. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question from Uganda was, as I heard, it was about conflict, management of conflict, if maybe there's a change in the tariff, if I heard correctly, but it's a general issue. So how, and it's a good sideway into how are conflicts managed in PPPs, and are we learning about even better ways of addressing and anticipating conflicts? I don't know if any of you would start on that.
You know, in the beginning, usually the governments would like to take a very conservative approach towards these kind of projects. This is what we faced with the first project that we tendered, actually. We took almost 2 years through parliamentary interrogations. And there are 3 still current lawsuits, still pending in courts. And we've been accused by a lot of false claims from the parliament members, from the public, and etc. Yet, right now, with the, I would say, the economic reform taken by the country and some of the austerity measures that have been taken, everything right now, new projects are being sent to us. They tell every public utility when they come, or public entity, there is no budget for this, go to CAP, tender it via PPP framework, which is kind of putting a lot of pressure on us. But then the problem is, not all kind of projects are feasible to be tendered on PPP. You have to understand, it has to be bankable, it has to be feasible, and there has to be a market interest in it. You know, some of the schemes for us was like, you know, they want to build their own headquarters, and I was telling them, you know, what's kind of thing? It's like it's gonna be only like construction operation management. It's not gonna be a high return for the market to be interested in. So you have to categorize it, and you have to prioritize it, and then you have to look for the potential partners. And seriously, the gentleman question, there is a lot of awareness. And I did this myself, actually. I went to many public entities and sat down with them, and I told them about our success stories and what we have, and asked them what they have on their plan, on their development plan, so that, you know, we could explore how we could study these to determine if they're feasible or not to be tendered on a PPP framework. Our role was passive, but right now we're taking more kind of proactive. And sometimes, you know, this is what, like, even, you know, the private sector would do with their products. You have to educate your user to make them buy your products.
There's a question in the back, and then I think there will be time maybe for one more. So if you want to ask a question, you should start thinking about it now, after the one we will hear now.
Thank you. My name is Lara Nassar. I'm from the WANA Institute from Jordan. I'd like to just maybe comment and ask a question. So one of the major issues which I think we should shed light on is that I don't think knowledge and awareness is a problem. We need to move from awareness to actually creating incentives for change, whether that's on the public sector or the private sector or the NGOs. An example which we are currently finding out in Jordan is that the public sector themselves sometimes do not find great incentives in wanting to change to green growth and or green energy. An example is that, for example, we've been trying to move public buildings in Jordan, and especially schools, to move to renewable energy. But the problem is that the returns are not going back to the ministry themselves, and or it's not going back to the infrastructure, which is a problem. So let's say if different schools in a different location can save up to 50,000 JDs a year on electricity bills using green energy and green growth, etc. That amount of money is not going back to them directly so that they can reinvest in it, which creates an incentive. So that problem creates a huge gap in wanting to provide and create incentive. So my question is, do you have any positive cases that could encourage the government to want to change that type of cash flow or return to basically push public buildings and the government themselves to want to move to green energy? Thank you.
Wissam, please, and then you are next.
Well, I think we had maybe one, and I mean, I fully understand the hesitation of moving. For example, in trying to move to renewable energy, simply because the prices of energy or electricity is already high in the country. Renewable energy looks like a great thing for example, the private sector. So lately, an example of that is lately about 10 or 12 hospitals in Jordan came together and they requested a license to generate about 50 megawatt of renewable energy. Well, if you know that hospitals are being charged the highest tariff in the country, they were viewed by the electricity company and by the government as what they call fleeing customers. These are the highest paying customers in the country, and if they go out and they do their own wheeling renewable energy, then that will actually, it's a source of revenue that the government would lose. So they have been very hesitant, although the law allows them to do so, but there is, we all know, there is all kind of procedural things and committees and etc. that we can do to slow down and stop something from happening. And to make it a win-win solution, we propose to them and say, how about if you, instead of 50 megawatt, you generate 60 megawatt, which is not going to increase too much the investment for you, and you donate that 10% of renewable energy into heating schools, for example. The hospitals love the idea because even with the 10 extra megawatt, it's still very feasible for them to generate their own electricity. In return, the government find that as a great deal where they're getting free electricity to heat schools, for example. So sometimes you just have to be creative in finding win-win solution and find incentives for people to allow them to move forward. And I think you have another good example.
Actually, this is something which I find truly kind of, even going back, even all the way to the consumer level. DEWA, when they have initiated their support program for integration of renewable energy to be used by the consumer themselves, they made aware the consumer of what is the accepted equipment that could be installed and what are the costs and what are the, I would say, the approved manufacturers. And they would use a feed-in system where they could reduce their bill. So we are, let's say, for example, at the public entity or the state itself, we are the one who should be setting the incentives or the requirements for the private sector. So, I mean, the private sector, if you tell them, I want a green project, you're the one who would tell them like this, They wouldn't do it unless, if of course, there's other way to manipulate it into raising the tariff, for example. Or even, right now we have changed the tariff for the commercial and the residential. So when you're going through other, I would say, for example, kind of institutional or legal tools and instruments, you could always push people and corner, and I'm just using this word, corner them, into going into, for example, into the green economy that we're looking for. I believe right now, what we, these past 2 days, we've been hearing about the success stories about what Dubai and UAE has been making. And even like actually in Jordan and even in Morocco, they've been working very hard and making great stories for integration for renewable energy. Whereas this region here, the GCC region, is still up to catch up to them. In Jordan, they have gone through all the capacities of the small scale all the way to the large scale. We would like to see that happening here on a continuous basis, not to have like a kind of thing which is called the kind of pilot project, actually. We are beyond the pilot projects right now.
Right. One more question, and then we will need to wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have one question. You touch upon the private sector. I would like to know, in our part of the world, the private partners are mostly international and with generally an exclusion of the local partners, local private sectors. I would like to know what is your experience in bringing in the PPP process local private sectors as opposed to international. Thank you.
Great question. Is the international investors crowding out private capital and private operators?
Okay, this is a very tough question, actually.
That's not an easy one.
I'd like to, we have came across this kind of experience, and I was even talking today about it. See, when we have decided initially to go through the BBB, we had a local monopoly by the local companies who are actually being as local agents for manufacturers, which is, it's being controlled, and you're like, this monopoly would never open. So when you open up the market for international players to come and to compete fairly with the locals without any discrimination and make them to compete apple for an apple on the same terms and condition, you know who will give you the expertise and the technology and the support. Because honestly, and I'm talking, this is my own opinion for my own state at the current status right now, some of, and not all of them, some of the local players, there is no added value. They act as, I would say, a front face. And there is no added value for this. But, huh? And the banks is coming next, just wait. So when they faced international competition, they know they have to strive either to survive or stay behind. And they have started working on themselves. Alongside, of course, when you have international developers and sponsors coming into your country or my country, whatever it is, they're going to bring international funds. These international developers, they have good and huge credit line from international corporations on multiple projects. Now, when this is international corporations coming into Kuwait, they don't have a working relationship with the local banks. And these local banks, they don't have any kind of, I would say, shared assets or shared relationship prior to this. So for the local currencies and tranches, it will be very minimal. Now, the local banks came back to us, and they will say, like, please help us. How do we get in touch with them? I said, like, well, you know the names. They've been advertised in the local newspapers. They said, like, no, we need to work with them. I said, that's your own homework. Go and work on it. They don't know project finance. And honestly, I have been, personally recommending them to go into, into executive seminars and workshops for project finance. Because, and I'm talking about the status, we have a lot of liquidity into the market from the local banks. There is a lot of money. They don't know what to do with it. The status, what I'm talking about, like the state of Kuwait, is a G2B business. The local business is surviving on government projects. And that's it. If there is no government projects, there's nothing. But when you enable these BBB projects, you're creating multiple special SBV companies. Now, there's more interaction for having a B2B, as well as you're circulating the money within the country itself. And you're giving them opportunity for these local banks even to break this barrier, to get into project finance, and hopefully cross the border and even finance other projects in the region as well.
I think we have to wrap it up here. So The whole purpose of this is to have a dialogue. So I really want to thank all of you who had questions and showed interest in this topic, and of course also to our three panelists. I would suggest that you try to talk to them before they leave, because they clearly have a lot of experience. So I just want to thank you all, and maybe you'll give me a hand in thanking the panelists.